Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Mr. White here with your Unit 3 AP Macroeconomics test review, all about aggregate supply and demand. So what you want to do is get out that purple test review and follow along. All right. First thing that you need to know how to do is draw and label the aggregate model of supply and demand. Very simple. Remember, we got our price level on the y-axis, we got our real GDP on the x-axis, and the first thing you'll want to draw is your aggregate demand. Remember, the aggregate demand is the demand for all final goods and services in the economy. In other words, it's the same thing as real GDP. Uh, our aggregate demand is always going to have a downward sloping demand curve. Okay, that's because consumers are sensitive to the price level. So at higher price levels, we demand less output than we do at low price levels. Now, the aggregate demand curve will shift anytime there's a change to the components of real GDP. Because, like I said, aggregate demand is conceptually the same thing as real GDP. So if we have a change to consumer spending, a change to business investment, change to government spending, or a change to our exports or our imports, that's going to have an effect on our aggregate demand curve. If any of those things increase our GDP, aggregate demand shifts to the right. If any of those things decrease GDP, aggregate demand shifts to the left. Now, after we've done our aggregate demand, now we got to talk about aggregate supply. So since aggregate demand shows the demand for output at all different price levels, aggregate supply shows the amount of output that producers are willing and able to create at different price levels. Now, the first kind of aggregate supply you need to know about is long-run aggregate supply. That shows all of our factors of production that are available in our country. For this reason, it's conceptually the same thing as the production possibilities curve. In other words, the long-run aggregate supply is equal to our land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Now, because of that, output is not influenced by the price level when it comes to our long-run aggregate supply. In the long run, a period of time longer than 2 years, we can basically allow the price of our factors of production to match whatever the level of output is. So in other words, the output that we get is not influenced by the price level. Our overall factors of production don't change when the CPI changes. You know, if the CPI increases, we're not going to suddenly have more labor or more natural resources or more capital, right? So that's why in the long run, our factors of production aren't related to the price level. Now, down there at the bottom, you'll see YF. YF means full output, full employment. So where the level of LRAS is located is the same area where our full employment is and the same area where our expected output is, meaning what we would call full output. So if we're at the LRAS, we're at our natural rate of unemployment, 4 to 6%. Now, the only thing that would shift our LRAS is if there was a permanent change to the factors of production. So if we had a big war that destroyed half our country, like what's happening in Syria, or if we had like a plague or something like that, that would shift our LRAS. But generally, the LRAS doesn't move very much. I wouldn't worry about shifting that too much on the test tomorrow. All right, now, aggregate supply, we said it shows what we're willing to produce at all different price levels. Remember, there's another aggregate supply curve called the short-run aggregate supply. On your aggregate model, you can just call it AS. Now, the short-run aggregate supply shows the amount of output that producers can generate in less than 2 years. We know that in a short time scale, producers can actually crank their output beyond what's normal or what's expected based on our factors of production. So in the short run, in a time period less than 2 years, our aggregate supply curve is going to slope upward because in the short run, producers are sensitive to the price level. And at a higher price level, they're going to want to produce more output than they would at a lower price level. Now, the only thing that shifts our aggregate supply curve is if there's a change to one of these three basic categories. And there's a lot of things that could fall under each category, but basically the three categories that shift our aggregate supply in the short run would be changes to productivity, like new technology or things that make workers able to do more, input costs. And of course, remember the biggest input cost faced by every business is the cost of labor. So generally, if we ever hear about the cost of labor changing, that's going to have an effect on aggregate supply before it affects aggregate demand or anything else. The other thing too with input costs is if you hear anything about oil, generally oil is one of the most important inputs that affects virtually every single product produced in our economy. So if the price of oil changes, that's going to be something else that's almost always going to shift our aggregate supply. The last thing that would shift aggregate supply is changes to government policies. So for example, if the government changes taxes or regulations, that's going to affect how much producers can create. Generally, when there are fewer taxes or fewer regulations, producers can create more. But if you increase taxes or regulations, producers will create less. So those are the three basic things that would shift aggregate supply: productivity, input costs, and government policies. Now, we need to know about long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, or just long-run equilibrium. This is when actual output matches expected output. So when we have all three of our lines intersecting together, like you see here on the graph, that's what we call long-run equilibrium. Okay, so this is the intersection of LRAS, aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. It indicates that the economy is at full employment and full output. So when we're at this point, like you see here on our graph, the price level is sort of a normal price level on the CPI. Our output in terms of GDP is exactly what's expected, and for that reason, our unemployment is at the natural rate, so somewhere between 4 to 6%. Now, if we shift one of our curves around, we're going to create a gap. If the gap is to the right, we would call it an inflationary gap. That's when actual output is greater than expected output. It looks something like this. When our aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, as you've just seen, we create a new equilibrium. Okay? Now, at this new equilibrium, our unemployment rate is going to be lower than the natural rate. So it's going to be somewhere less than 4% at this new point Y2. This usually causes the price level to rise. When our unemployment rate is lower than normal, more people are spending money and producers have to raise their prices. And so we would see the CPI would rise. That's why you see from PL1, we've raised up to PL2. And from YF, as I said, we increased our output. So now we're at Y2, which is a higher level of output. All right, now for shifting our aggregate demand in the opposite direction, to the left, we would create a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap is when our actual output is less than our expected output. So this causes our unemployment to rise above the natural rate. It'd be greater than 6%. It looks a little something like this. So you see I shifted aggregate demand to the left. Now we've got a new equilibrium at PL2 and Y2. You'll see that our real GDP decreased and the price level decreased. This is what happens in a contraction of the business cycle, or a recession. That's why we call it a recessionary gap. Because in this point, we're not producing as much as we should be producing. And so that means that we have factories maybe that are being unused. We have workers that are getting laid off. That's why the unemployment rate is higher. And if we were imagining this on our production possibilities curve, this would be like one of those points to the inside of the curve, which would be considered inefficient. So generally, the price level is always going to fall in this situation. The only time we wouldn't see the price level fall is if we have stagflation. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. All right, aggregate supply versus aggregate demand. We've pretty much talked about this, but let's go through it again. Aggregate demand shows all the output that consumers are willing and able to purchase at different price levels. So when we think about aggregate demand, we're mainly thinking about consumers in the economy. So we're thinking of like households or the government, or we could also be talking about business investment. Like let's say a business decides they're going to build a new location. That would also fall under aggregate demand. Also keep in mind that exports and imports are a big part of our aggregate demand as well. So if we talk about the demand for American products abroad, or if we talk about America's trading partners, any of those keywords are going to tell you we're talking about aggregate demand. So remember, the aggregate demand shifts if there's a change to our GDP. Any changes to consumer spending, business investment, government spending, or net exports. Now, aggregate supply is different. As we said, aggregate supply shows the output that producers are willing and able to create at different prices. Now, this is mainly focused on producers. When we talk about aggregate supply, we're talking about businesses. So remember that the only things that shift our aggregate supply would be changes to business productivity. Remember how much output you get from each input. That's what we mean by productivity. Of course, input costs. How much do we have to pay for our land, labor, and capital? And then government regulations or taxes on businesses. Keep in mind, if we talk about taxes on individuals, that's going to affect our aggregate demand. But if we talk about taxes that businesses have to pay, like for example, excise taxes, those are going to affect our aggregate supply. Now, remember there's a big link between our long-run aggregate supply and the production possibilities curve and the business cycle. On your assessment, you had to draw all three of them together. So remember that conceptually, our long-run aggregate supply is the exact same thing as our production possibilities curve. Remember that our production possibilities curve shows our factors of production, and the LRAS does the exact same thing. So on the business cycle, the LRAS is the same thing as that trend line. See that little purple dotted trend line? So that shows the expected output of our economy, and we know that the economy fluctuates around that expected output. Sometimes the output is higher than expected, and we call that a peak. Sometimes it's lower than expected, and we call that a trough. And as we move from peak to trough, we actually cross through that level of expected output, and then slightly above it, slightly below it. As you can see, it's kind of a wave pattern that sort of fluctuates around our expected level of output. So just keep in mind that the LRAS is the same thing as the production possibilities curve and the same thing as the trend line on our business cycle. Okay, now when we talk about the unemployment rate, remember that the unemployment rate is going to change based on whether we have an inflationary gap on our aggregate model or a recessionary gap. Inflationary gaps happen when we have increases of output beyond the normal level of output, beyond YF. Remember that if we're ever shifting ourselves to the right of our LRAS, that is an inflationary gap. In this situation, we need more utilization of our factors of production. Like we need to use more land and capital and of course more labor, so more workers. That's the reason why the unemployment rate goes up. Or I'm sorry, that's the reason why the unemployment rate goes down. Sorry about that, don't make that mistake. Now, as a result, more people get employed, and so the unemployment rate decreases during an inflationary gap. That's an important thing to remember. Unemployment goes down in an inflationary gap. Now, in a recessionary gap, the opposite is true. That's when output falls below the normal level, YF. This means that businesses are required, I can't talk. This means businesses are requiring fewer of their factors of production. They're not utilizing as much labor or as much land or as much capital, and for that reason, a lot of people lose their jobs. So, unemployment rates increase during the recessionary gap, just like we would expect to see unemployment increase during a recession of the business cycle. All right, now fiscal policy, guys, hopefully you already watched the video. There's another video on my YouTube. Go to my YouTube, watch the video about fiscal policy. It's about 15 minutes, but it's full of information that you absolutely need to know for the test tomorrow. So please don't take an L on that one, right? Watch the video. Now, in case you don't watch the video, here's just a quick rundown that maybe will help you a bit on the test. Fiscal policy means changing government spending and or taxes to reduce those short-term fluctuations in our output, meaning the government can smooth out the business cycle, the ups and the downs of the business cycle, by changing how much they spend or changing how much they tax the people of the country. Now, Congress and the President of the United States are in control of our fiscal policy. And in case you forgot, that is the executive branch and the legislative branch, right? Congress is legislative, the President is the executive. So, fiscal policy, when you hear that, it means how does the government try to smooth out our economy, okay? Now, there's two kinds of fiscal policy, expansionary and contractionary. You would want to use expansionary fiscal policy during a contraction phase of the business cycle. In a contraction, the economy is suffering. Real GDP is falling and unemployment is rising. So the number one thing the government's trying to do is stop the rising unemployment rate and get our real GDP growing again. The best way that they can do that is by increasing consumer spending. We know consumer spending is 70% of our GDP. So the government wants to do everything they can to put more money in people's hands so that, ceteris paribus, they can spend more money. The way the government does that is they decrease taxes and they increase government spending. So decreasing taxes lets people keep more of their own cash and they'll go spend it in the economy. And when the government spends more on programs like, for example, food stamps, or if the government hires more teachers, once again, that's going to help increase disposable income. The reason why food stamps increase disposable income is because people don't have to spend as much of their money on food. And if they hire teachers, once again, that's more people getting paychecks, so more people spend money. So generally, cutting taxes and increasing spending helps expand our business cycle, and that's why it's called expansionary policy. It's what we would use during a contraction of the business cycle. Now, if we're in an expansion phase of the business cycle, that's really good, but remember, we start having problems with inflation. Inflation is when prices are rising. So to stop prices from rising, the best thing you can do is make people stop spending money. That will cut down on demand-full inflation. So to stop people from spending money, you need to raise their taxes, because that takes money out of their pocket before they ever get it, and decrease government spending. When you decrease government spending, people have to spend more of their own money for things like food or medical care. The government's not paying for it. And so in that way, the government saves money and they help slow down the growth of the economy so that inflation stays under control. So please make sure you know what expansionary fiscal policy looks like and what contractionary fiscal policy looks like. Expansionary policy is used in the contraction phase of the economy, and contractionary policy is used in the expansion phase of the economy. Just remember that the type of policy we use is always going to be the opposite of what's happening in the economy. Now, when it comes to fiscal policy, sometimes it can be really hard for government to make decisions. We know that Congress doesn't always do great passing laws because they spend so much time arguing with each other. And so that's why it's great that we have these things called automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are kind of like putting your fiscal policy on autopilot. That's basically when the government has laws in place that will automatically smooth out fluctuations in the economy. And it doesn't require Congress or the president to do anything. It's just going to happen automatically. So two great examples of this are unemployment insurance and the progressive tax code. With unemployment insurance, when the economy suffers and more people lose their jobs, the government automatically spends more money because more people qualify for this unemployment benefit. So the way that it works is basically if you've been laid off for no fault of your own due to a downturn in the economy, the government will pay you a percentage of your old salary while you look for work. This allows you to keep spending money, which is good for the economy, right? It's increasing government spending. And the cool thing about it is government doesn't have to do anything. It just happens when the economy suffers. Now, if the economy starts doing better, more and more people get employed, fewer people will apply for unemployment insurance, and so automatically government spending goes down. It's a pretty cool thing. Now, another example that has to do with taxes could be the kind of tax code we have. In the United States, we have what's called a progressive tax code. That means that the more money you make, the more money the government takes. So if you're somebody who makes like $20,000 a year, you pay a small percentage of your money in tax. But if you're somebody who makes a lot of money, like a millionaire, you're going to pay a much higher percentage of your pay in taxes. So when the economy is doing good, people pay more taxes automatically because they make more money. When the economy is doing bad, people pay less taxes automatically because they're making less money. Automatic stabilizers. Now, the way the government can know how cutting or raising taxes will affect the economy is through something called the tax multiplier. That shows how much a change in taxes will impact our real GDP. It's kind of like the spending multiplier, but it's for cutting or raising taxes. So the tax multiplier is MPC divided by MPS times the change in taxes. So go ahead and write that one down. MPC is marginal propensity to consume. MPS is marginal propensity to save. Hopefully you still remember what those things are. Now, the way this works is like, let's say, for example, if the MPC in our economy is 0.8. We know that if the MPC in the economy is 0.8, the MPS must be 0.2. So we would do 0.8 divided by 0.2, which is equal to 4. 4 times whatever the change in taxes will tell us the impact on GDP. So let's say if the government wants to increase taxes by $100 billion. Well, increasing taxes is going to decrease our productivity, right? It's going to take money away from businesses. So 4 times 100 billion equals 400 billion. It means that essentially that would take $400 billion out of the economy. Same thing works if we did a $100 billion tax cut. Cutting taxes by $100 billion in this scenario would increase GDP by $400 billion. Now, when the government wants to spend more money, sometimes that causes problems for the economy. Obviously, government spending more money would help, make our GDP grow. But sometimes it doesn't grow as much as we might think because the government creates some unintended consequences when they borrow a lot. Now, unfortunately, when the government wants to spend money, they usually don't have that money just on hand. I know we might think the government has lots of money, but really they don't. So if the government wants to build more roads or fight a war, they have to borrow money to make that happen. This is what's called deficit spending because we actually have to spend more than what we bring in taxes, and that increases our national debt over time. Now that's of course problematic. Nobody likes debt, but the thing about crowding out is that when the government borrows money, it's usually such a large amount of money that it's going to cause interest rates all over the economy to rise. When demand for money increases, the cost of borrowing money increases. That makes sense, right? When demand for something is high, the price usually rises. And so this is the reason why the interest rate rises when the government borrows a lot of money. Now, unfortunately, higher interest rates discourage businesses from taking out loans. Businesses usually need loans to invest, so therefore, if businesses don't take out loans, then business investment is going to fall. So that means that even though more government spending can increase aggregate demand, it won't increase aggregate demand as much as the government would like because they're they're stifling business investment, and that actually slows down the growth of the economy. And this is what economists call crowding out. the government actually crowds out private investment because they're borrowing so much money, and it forces the interest rates to rise. Now, stagflation is something else that's kind of negative, kind of like crowding out. Now, stagflation means that sometimes we actually have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. We know that usually when unemployment is high, inflation is low, but that's not always the case. If our SRAS were to decrease, meaning like if we had a leftward shift of our SRAS like you see in the graph here, what happens is that our price level will increase and our output will decrease. This is like what happened in the 1970s when we had that oil embargo, where we were cut off from oil supplies by OPEC. Remember, oil is a really important determinant of our SRAS. So in the 1970s, our SRAS shifted to the left. That meant that everything in the economy got more expensive, and at the same time, people were losing their jobs. This is literally like the worst thing that can happen in the economy. So remember that stagflation is that nasty situation where we have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. All right, identify these terms. We've already gone over most of this stuff. There's a couple we didn't really talk about. When we talk about discretionary fiscal policy, that's when the government actually has to pass laws. It's the opposite of automatic fiscal policy. So you should go watch that fiscal policy video, okay? Now, the judicial branch, just in case you didn't know, the judicial branch is like the Supreme Court and all the federal circuit courts of the United States. It's important for you to know that because the judicial branch has no control over fiscal policy. Wink, wink. So if you see that on the test tomorrow, the judicial branch has nothing to do with fiscal policy. Remember, it's only president and the Congress, right? The executive and the legislative branch that control fiscal policy. Now, progressive taxes, we did talk about that. Just remember, that means that the percentage of tax that you owe to the government increases as your income increases. So for example, if you make $30,000 a year, you owe about 10% of that in taxes, so like $3,000. But if you make $300,000 a year, you actually owe about 35% of that in taxes. So, my gosh, I think that would be about $90,000 or so. It's a lot of money, okay? So make sure you know the difference between like a progressive tax and like a sales tax or something. Progressive taxes are an automatic stabilizer, and it's the kind of taxes that everybody pays when they get their paycheck in our economy. Okay, that's pretty much it, guys. I know this was kind of a rushed review, but just take your time, study this information, and just relax and do the best you can on the test tomorrow. And trust me, everything is going to be all right. See you next time.